February 27, 2024, a cold, damp morning in East London when Bernard Fowler, 87, left his home for his usual routine. For years, his days had been simple. A quiet walk to Haroldwood Station, a newspaper in hand, and a quiet return to the solace of his home. He had no family left, no living children, and no need for grand distractions. The rhythm of his life was steady and peaceful until that fateful day. The station was familiar to him. He had walked this path countless times. But that morning, something felt off. The cold, still air seemed to carry a weight, an unspoken tension. Unbeknownst to Bernard, his life was about to be ripped apart by the actions of a man he had never met. Miles, 23, stood at the station platform, but his mind was elsewhere. Far from the cold concrete beneath his feet, far from the buzzing world around him. Miles had grown up in East London, but his life had never been easy. As a child, he had shown signs of distress, moments when he seemed disconnected from the world. His parents had done their best, but the cracks in his mental state had only deepened over the years. Diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia as a teenager, Miles's world had become a confusing maze of voices and visions. Without the proper treatment, he had spiraled out of control, the sharpness of his delusions growing more vivid and terrifying. By the time Bernard Fowler crossed his path, Sekai was in a mental state so fragile, so fractured, that he no longer saw people as they were. To him, everyone around him was a threat, a danger lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. He hadn't been taking his medication for weeks, the voices in his head screaming louder and louder each day. The moment Bernard entered his line of sight, Miles's delusions took over completely. There was no reasoning with him. Bernard, in his fragile age, had become a symbol of the threats Miles imagined in his mind. Without a word, without any provocation, Miles struck. The attack came quickly. Bernard had no chance to defend himself. Miles yanked the walking stick from his hand, and in one vicious motion, gouged Bernard's eyes. The old man's blood stained the platform, mixing with the cold London air. But Miles didn't stop there. In his delusion, he believed that Bernard wasn't just a helpless elderly man. He was an enemy that had to be eradicated. He stomped on Bernard's head, repeatedly, each blow pushing him further away from the reality of the world. As Bernard lay lifeless, Miles stood over him, victorious, but detached, like an actor playing a part he didn't understand. He didn't know what he had done, not truly. To him, the act had been an inevitability, a necessary response to the invisible enemies he thought surrounded him. The investigation was swift. Miles wasn't trying to escape. After the attack, he wandered the streets in a daze, detached from the gravity of his actions. He had no destination, no escape plan. Only the thick fog in his mind and the oppressive voices whispering in his ears. It was hours before he was arrested, caught after assaulting a police officer who attempted to apprehend him. When the police searched his background, they quickly uncovered a history of untreated mental illness. Miles had been living with paranoid schizophrenia for years, but without consistent care or medication, his mind had deteriorated. His delusions grew more vivid, and his perception of reality became twisted. The police learned that, at the time of the attack, Miles had stopped taking his medication for several weeks. In his deranged state, he had seen Bernard Fowler as an enemy, his elderly appearance irrelevant to the deep, consuming paranoia that drove him to commit murder. The authorities couldn't deny the chilling nature of the crime, but the key question lingered. Could a man who was so deeply out of touch with reality truly be held accountable for such a brutal act? There was no personal connection between Miles and Bernard. Miles had no animosity toward the elderly man. There wasn't a robbery gone wrong, nor a vendetta that had been building for years. The attack was as random as it was brutal, but there was a driving force behind it: mental illness. Miles had long been haunted by delusions of persecution. His mind had broken down to the point where his perception of reality no longer aligned with the world around him. To Miles, Bernard had been a threat. In his fractured mind, the attack had been inevitable. A preemptive strike against an enemy he imagined was waiting to harm him. The cruelty of the crime wasn't driven by hatred, terrifying grip of mental illness. There was no logic, no reasoning with the delusions that had controlled Miles's actions. The courtroom became the next battleground. Instead of a traditional trial, Sekai Miles's defense team argued for diminished responsibility. It wasn't about whether he had committed the murder, it was about understanding why. His lawyers presented evidence of his untreated schizophrenia, explaining how the illness had warped his perception of reality. The prosecution, while acknowledging the severity of Miles's actions, focused on the need for justice for Bernard Fowler and his family. They argued that despite his illness, Miles had to be held accountable. The victim's family, his relatives, some of whom had survived the pain of losing a loved one to such senseless violence, sat in silence, their faces a portrait of sorrow and confusion. In the end, the court's decision stunned many. Sekai Miles was not sentenced to prison. Instead, he was given an indefinite hospital order. This meant that, instead of serving time in a prison cell, Miles would be confined to a psychiatric hospital, where he would remain until deemed fit for release. This was not a sentence of justice as most would understand it, but a reflection of a system that couldn't fully comprehend the depth of mental illness or the true horror of what had unfolded. For the family of Bernard Fowler, the sentence was a hollow one. There was no justice that could bring him back, no resolution to the agony they felt. Their grief wasn't simply for the loss of their loved one, but for the system that failed to prevent the crime in the first place. They knew that the true tragedy wasn't just in the death of Bernard, but in the failure to properly address the silent killer of mental illness that had taken a young man's life and twisted it into something unrecognizable. The emotional fallout from the crime continued long after the trial. Bernard Fowler's family was left to mourn the senseless death of a man who had been as much a part of the community as he had been a part of their lives. But the questions lingered. How had this happened? What could have been done to prevent it? As for Sekai Miles, his future was uncertain. The indefinite hospital order meant that no one could say when or if he would ever be able to re-enter society. Some believed that the psychiatric care he received would eventually heal him, but others feared that he was beyond saving. In the end, it was the tragedy of mental illness, a tragedy that had claimed the lives of both Bernard Fowler and the man who had killed him, that left the deepest scars. The true crime wasn't just the murder, it was the reminder that sometimes the darkest monsters aren't born from malice, but from minds that can no longer distinguish between the real and the imagined. If you found Bernard Fowler's story gripping and love to see more true crime stories, make sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss out on our subsequent posts. Stay tuned for more chilling true crime cases only on Crime Uncovered.